Padre Pio saw a man approaching from across the courtyard of San Giovanni Rotondo, watched him cross the stones, watched him join the line outside the confessional, and said to the friar standing beside him, "That man has already decided what he will tell me and what he won't. He has traveled 400 kilometers. He will travel 400 kilometers home, and he will leave without receiving what he came for." The friar didn't understand. The man looked perfectly devout. He was carrying his rosary. He had been waiting in line since before dawn. What could Padre Pio possibly have seen? He had seen exactly what this video is about. He had seen the shape of a soul that was preparing to manage God rather than meet him. And 40 years later, when the story of Marco Rinaldi finally became known, through the testimonies collected during Padre Pio's beatification process, the Church began to understand something that very few Catholics had been willing to say out loud, that the most dangerous kind of confessor is not the liar who invents sins that didn't happen. It is the one who arrives with everything almost true, who confesses 9 things with complete sincerity and hides the 10th with practiced skill, who deletes the file, burns the notebook, closes the app, and walks through the door of the confessional, holding only the portion of himself that he has decided God is allowed to see. This is what most people don't realize. And I have to say it plainly, I've been a practicing Catholic for 62 years. I've sat in confession hundreds of times, and I understand from the inside the temptation that Marco Rinaldi faced. Not because I am a dishonest person, but because there is something in every human soul that instinctively tries to negotiate with grace. That wants to offer God the part of itself that it can afford to hand over and quietly pocket the rest. Padre Pio called this the most spiritually costly form of self-deception a Catholic can engage in. And in today's video, I'm going to show you exactly why, using the detailed account of what happened when Marco arrived at San Giovanni Rotondo on a Tuesday morning in March of 1956, carrying everything he intended to say and leaving behind everything he intended to keep. There is a phenomenon that every Catholic who has ever used a confession preparation app will recognize immediately. You open the app, you work through the examination of conscience, and somewhere in the middle of that examination, you reach a question or a category of sin that makes something in you flinch, not dramatically, quietly. A small interior recoil, like touching something hot and pulling your hand back before your mind has even registered what happened. And in that moment, you have a choice. You can stay with the flinch, you can press into it, name what caused it, add it to your list. Or you can let your finger drift past it. Move on to the next item. Tell yourself you'll come back to it, knowing, even as you say it, that you won't. And if you're reading this on a phone right now, there is a version of this story that is even more literal. The confession app on your home screen that you opened once, got partway through, felt that flinch, and then closed. Maybe even deleted. Not because you stopped believing in the sacrament, but because the sacrament in that moment was asking for something you weren't sure you were ready to give. Padre Pio understood this dynamic with the precision of a man who had spent 50 years inside the confessional. He had heard tens of thousands of confessions. He had read souls. He had seen, in the mystical way that his charism allowed, exactly what people were carrying when they came to him, and exactly what they had left in the bag they set down outside the door. And he said repeatedly to his spiritual directors and to the friars who served alongside him that the sin of concealment in confession was not a small failure of courage. It was a spiritual act with consequences that propagated outward through the soul in ways that the person concealing rarely anticipated. It compounded, it spread, it changed the quality of everything else, the prayers, the other confessions, the communions that followed, the capacity to receive grace at all. Because every time you receive the sacrament while deliberately withholding something from it, You are not receiving a partial absolution. You are receiving something far worse. Stay with me. Because what Padre Pio saw in Marco Rinaldi's soul, when that man finally walked into the confessional after destroying his written list, after rehearsing his partial confession for 4 days on the train south from Milan, is one of the most precise and disturbing descriptions of spiritual self-damage I have ever encountered in my years of studying this man's life. Before I tell you Marco's story, I want to say something from my own experience as a Catholic woman who has sat in hundreds of confessions across 6 decades. When I was in my late 30s, I attended a parish mission, a week of special preaching and confession opportunities in Coventry, led by a visiting Franciscan friar. On the 3rd evening, the friar said something from the pulpit that I have never forgotten. He said, "Most of you are not here because you are great sinners. Most of you are here because you are good Catholics who have been carrying one thing for too long, and that one thing is why you came tonight." I remember the specific physical sensation of those words, a kind of internal recognition that bypassed my thinking and went straight to something underneath. I knew what my one thing was. I had known for 3 years. And I sat in that pew and I felt with absolute clarity that I was going to walk out of that church at the end of the evening without saying it again. And I felt disgusted with myself, not with dramatic revulsion, but with the quiet, tired disgust of a person who has been repeating the same choice for 3 years and has run out of ways to convince herself it is anything other than what it is. What kept me from saying it was not ignorance and not malice. It was a particular form of pride that I think is very common among devout Catholics, the conviction that if I could just understand it better, frame it more precisely, make it more theologically coherent in my own mind, then I would be ready to confess it properly, as if the sacrament required me to have done all the work first, as if God needed me to present him with a finished analysis before he could act. Padre Pio would have recognized this immediately. He saw it constantly in his confessional. The soul that is waiting to be ready before it surrenders. The soul that is, without knowing it, trying to confess from a position of strength rather than of need. Marco Rinaldi was 44 years old in the spring of 1956. He worked as an accountant in Milan, managing the finances for several mid-sized manufacturing firms, respected in his parish, known for his punctuality, his careful mind, and his quarterly confessions to a local priest who had known him for 20 years. He was not a man who lived dramatically. He went to Mass every Sunday, said grace before meals, kept a framed image of Padre Pio on the wall of his office that several clients had commented on over the years. His wife, Elena, considered him the steadiest person she had ever known. His 3 children, Roberto, 16, Lucia, 13, and the youngest, Giulio, 8, had never seen their father raise his voice in anger. By every visible measure, Marco Rinaldi was a devout and well-ordered Catholic man. But 8 years earlier, in the winter of 1948, Marco had done something that he had never confessed to anyone, not to his parish priest, not to any confessor, not in the regular quarterly confessions, not in the annual retreats, not in any of the dozens of times he had received the sacrament in the years since. He had engineered the financial ruin of his business partner, Giancarlo Ferretti. The details of what happened between Marco and Giancarlo are preserved in the beatification testimony of Brother Francesco, who heard Marco's account directly during his stay at San Giovanni Rotondo. In 1946, the 2 men had been equal partners in a small accounting firm they had built together over 7 years. When a major contract came available, a contract that would transform the firm from a modest operation into something substantially larger, Marco had discovered, through a contact, that Giancarlo was planning to propose dissolving the partnership and taking the contract himself. What Marco did next was not violent, not illegal in any way that could be proven. It was simply precise. He used his access to the firm's financial records to document a series of accounting irregularities that, while not fraudulent, were presented to the contract client in a way that made Giancarlo look incompetent and unreliable. The contract went to Marco's new solo firm. Giancarlo's reputation in the Milan business community was destroyed. He spent the next 3 years in financial difficulty, moved his family to a smaller city, and Marco heard through mutual acquaintances that his former partner had eventually found stable, modest work in a town near Genoa. Marco had told himself, in the years that followed, several versions of a story that made what he had done something other than what it was. The irregularities were real. The client deserved to know. Giancarlo had been planning to betray him first. These were the sentences he had rehearsed so often that they had taken on the texture of fact. But the sin was not the sentences. The sin was in what Marco felt every time he sat in the confessional and reached the point in his examination of conscience where it should have appeared, and deliberately chose a different path. He confessed impatience. He confessed pride. He confessed failures in family charity, moments of anger at his staff, the occasional neglect of the evening prayer. He was not fabricating these things. They were real, but every time he confessed them and received absolution and went to communion with the clean, light feeling of a soul that had been washed, there was something waiting for him on the other side of that feeling. Not guilt exactly, something heavier and quieter, a particular quality of silence where the Giancarlo thing lived. And over 8 years, that silence had spread. Hold on, because this is where the account of Brother Francesco introduces something that changes the entire frame of what you have been hearing. Marco had kept, from the very beginning of his spiritual life, a written examination of conscience, a leather-bound notebook bought in Florence that he had been filling for more than 20 years. Every sin he had committed, recorded carefully, examined honestly, brought to confession. Every sin except one. And the notebook was honest about the exception, because on one of its pages, in Marco's careful accountant's hand, written in the margin in pencil so faint it could barely be read, were the words, Giancarlo, not yet. He had written them in 1949. He had not erased them, year after year, opening the notebook for his quarterly examination, seeing those 2 words in the margin and choosing each time to leave them where they were. Not yet, not yet, not yet. And then, in February of 1956, Marco decided to visit Padre Pio. He had never been to San Giovanni Rotondo. He had decided, after a month of deliberation, that this was the year he would finally confess the Giancarlo matter, not to his ordinary parish confessor who knew him too well, but to a stranger, someone who didn't know his face or his business reputation, someone who would simply hear the thing in the darkness of the confessional and give him the absolution and the penance and let him leave it behind. Padre Pio seemed like the right person for a heavy sin, strong enough to carry it, far enough away to be safe. 4 days before his departure, Marco opened the leather notebook for a final review. He read through the entries. He found the margin note. Giancarlo, not yet. And he tore the page out. He tore out the 3 pages before it and the 2 after it as well, to make sure nothing connected. He burned them in the kitchen ashtray. He packed the notebook, now missing 6 pages, in his bag. And he told himself that he had simply removed what was already in his memory. He knew what he needed to confess. He didn't need the paper. But here is what no one in Marco's story had anticipated, including Marco himself. What no one understood, until Padre Pio's response made it visible, was what the burning of those pages had done not to the notebook, but to Marco's soul. Because the act of destroying the written record was not a neutral act of housekeeping. It was in the mystical architecture of the spiritual life that Padre Pio understood with extraordinary precision a significant spiritual event. It was the moment when "not yet" became something more deliberate, when a sin of omission accumulated across 8 years of partial confessions became a sin of commission, the active suppression of what the soul knew it owed to God. And Padre Pio saw it. He saw it from across the courtyard. Padre Pio had been examining souls for decades. He had seen, in the mystical sight that accompanied his stigmata, things that he rarely described in detail to anyone who was not his spiritual director. But in the case of Marco Rinaldi, the account that Brother Francesco recorded contains a specific description that Padre Pio gave, not to Marco directly at first, but to the young friar who was present in the hallway, of what he saw when Marco approached. He said, "That man has been giving God 9/10 of his soul for 8 years. The 10th part he's been keeping in a box, and now he has also locked the box and swallowed the key." Brother Francesco wrote that Padre Pio's expression when he said this was not anger. It was something closer to grief, the kind of grief a father feels when a child who has been hurt chooses over and over a form of protection that is actually making the wound worse. "He thinks he is protecting himself," Padre Pio said. "He is not protecting himself, he is protecting the wound." Marco entered the confessional. Padre Pio heard the first 3 minutes of his confession in silence. And then he stopped Marco. He did not speak loudly, he did not accuse. He said quietly in the darkness of the confessional, "There is something you have not said, and you burned the paper you wrote it on." Marco went completely still. He told Brother Francesco later that in that moment he felt something he had not expected, not shame exactly. More like the sensation of a pressure he had been holding for 8 years, suddenly finding, for the first time, an equal pressure on the other side. Like a door that had been held shut by the weight of his whole body, and someone had simply placed a hand on the other side, not forcing it, just matching his resistance with a steadiness that said, "Whenever you are ready, this door can open." This is where Padre Pio's teaching on what he called the spiritual boomerang of concealed sin becomes essential. And I want to give you his actual words on this, because they are preserved in a letter to his spiritual director, Padre Benedetto, written in the early 1940s after a particularly difficult period in his confessional ministry. He wrote, "The sins that are confessed are dissolved. The sins that are hidden are not merely retained, they begin to generate. The soul that conceals a grave matter from the sacrament does not receive partial grace. It receives the full weight of the sacrament's absence in that area, compounded each time it approaches the altar without that matter resolved. The wound grows a shell, the shell grows a room. The room begins to fill with everything that should have been brought to God and wasn't, until there is no longer a small locked box. There is a separate life being conducted in the basement of the soul, maintained in darkness, drawing heat from the graces that were meant to flow freely through the entire house." That letter, preserved in the Capuchin archives, is one of the most precise spiritual descriptions of what happened to Marco's soul over 8 years that I have ever read. Not because it was written about Marco specifically, it was written years before their meeting, but because when Brother Francesco read it after Marco's visit, he said, Padre Pio had already described this man before he arrived. And here is the part of Padre Pio's teaching that most Catholics have never heard, because it requires a level of theological precision that most homilies don't reach. When you receive absolution in a valid confession, the sins you confessed are genuinely, completely, and permanently removed from your soul. The Church teaches this with full confidence. But what Padre Pio observed, in his unique capacity as both confessor and reader of souls, was that the sins you withheld do not simply remain static in their original state. They begin to interact with the sacramental graces you received for everything else, not neutralizing those graces entirely, God's mercy is not so easily blocked, but introducing a friction, a resistance, a partial opacity that affects the quality of every subsequent spiritual act. He described it in one of his letters as a fissure in the vessel. The vessel still holds water. Grace still reaches the soul, but a portion of what should reach it is lost through the crack, and the crack does not close itself. It must be sealed from the inside by the specific act of confession that addresses the specific thing that caused it. Furthermore, and this is the point that Marco Rinaldi discovered at great personal cost, each time you approach the sacrament while deliberately withholding a matter, you are not in a state of neutral omission. You are making an active choice, renewed each time, to manage God's access to your soul. And that choice itself, repeated over months and years, begins to form a habit of spiritual management that extends beyond the confessional. It begins to affect prayer, the quality of attention in the Mass, the capacity to hear the voice of God in Scripture or in silence, because the soul that has learned to present only its curated self to the sacrament gradually begins to present only its curated self to God in every context. The habit of protection, once established in confession, becomes the default mode of the entire interior life. This is the spiritual boomerang. You begin by protecting one thing. You end by being protected from everything. Few Catholics know this, but what Padre Pio was describing is not a rare or extreme situation. It is, by his own estimation, based on decades in the confessional, one of the most common forms of spiritual damage that devout Catholics carry. Not the dramatic sins, the grave public failures, the obvious breaks with the moral law. Those, in his experience, were often the easiest to confess, because their weight was obvious and their contours were clear. The harder cases, the ones that sat in the basement for years, were precisely the ones that looked from the outside like they might not even be serious enough to mention. The resentment nursed quietly for a decade, the money managed dishonestly in a way that could be rationalized, the relationship that was allowed to proceed further than it should have, and then sealed away behind the normal structure of a faithful life. The words spoken that damaged someone's reputation in ways that were never corrected. These were the things that people carried through year after year of genuinely sincere devotion, confessing everything around them with real honesty, while keeping this one thing in the box locked, protected, with the key swallowed. I've experienced this myself, and I can tell you, there was a period in my 40s when I went to confession regularly, faithfully, and came away each time with an inexplicable feeling of incompleteness. Not because my confessor was inadequate, not because the sacrament wasn't working, but because I had one category of sin, a cluster of things related to a specific relationship and the choices I had made in it, that I had decided were too complex, too contextually loaded, too difficult to summarize in a confessional, and so I consistently left them unaddressed. I told myself they were genuinely ambiguous. I told myself that once I had processed them more fully, I would bring them. But the processing never seemed to complete itself. And the communions I received in those years, while real, had a quality that I recognize now in retrospect as exactly what Padre Pio described. The grace was flowing, but it was flowing around something, not fully through me, hitting an obstruction. And the obstruction was not my lack of faith. It was my decision to protect one corner of my interior life from the mercy I was otherwise asking for freely. Marco Rinaldi sat in Padre Pio's confessional for 47 minutes. Brother Francesco, outside in the hallway, recorded the time. He said that when Marco came out, his face was completely altered. Not distressed in the way of someone who had been exposed or condemned, altered in the way of someone who had set down something very heavy that they had been holding for so long that they had stopped feeling its weight until the moment it left their hands. Marco made his penance. He went to Mass. He received communion, and Brother Francesco writes, "He said to me afterward in the courtyard, 'I spent 8 years carrying that thing to protect myself from something. I do not know what I thought I was protecting myself from. There was nothing there to be afraid of. There was only the thing itself and the grace waiting on the other side of it.'" 3 weeks after returning to Milan, Marco contacted Giancarlo Ferretti. He did not explain everything. He did not confess publicly or expose himself to legal risk. He acknowledged that he had damaged his former partner's reputation unjustly, offered a specific and concrete act of financial restitution, and asked for forgiveness. Giancarlo, according to the account Brother Francesco later compiled, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been waiting 8 years for this call. I wasn't sure it would come." The restoration of their relationship was incomplete. Too many years had passed. But the room in the basement of Marco's soul, the separate life that had been conducted in darkness, was finally empty. And the grace that had been pooling behind the obstruction for 8 years began to move freely through the house. Now I need to tell you something that might be the most important part of this entire video. Something Padre Pio said in the confessional to another man, recorded in the testimonies of a different friar, Brother Modestino, who spent years in close proximity to Padre Pio's confessional ministry. This other man had come to San Giovanni Rotondo carrying a sin he had held for 12 years. A different sin from Marco's, but with the same architecture. The long-held concealment, the partial confessions, the box in the basement. When this man confessed it at last, Padre Pio said to him, "Why did you wait? Did you think the grace was going to run out?" The man said he hadn't known how to say it. Padre Pio replied, "You didn't need to know how to say it. You only needed to arrive in front of God with the intention of not protecting it anymore." The words would have followed. Then Padre Pio asked him something that Brother Modestino recorded verbatim. "What year did you first think about bringing this here?" The man said, 8 years ago. And Padre Pio said, "Then you have lost 8 years. Not completely. The grace that should have flowed freely still reached you, partially around the edges, through the cracks. God does not abandon a soul that continues to seek him, even imperfectly. But 8 years of your interior life has been lived at partial capacity. Do not let it become 9. You just received one of the most detailed and spiritually precise accounts of what happens inside a soul that conceals a serious matter from the sacrament of confession, given by a man who spent more time inside the confessional than perhaps any other figure in the modern history of the Church. If this channel has given you something that cut through today, something that named a corner of your interior life that you have been protecting, then consider pressing the super thanks button below. It keeps this work alive. It keeps these testimonies reaching the people who need them. And it tells the algorithm that this kind of precision matters, that people are hungry for the truth of what the sacraments actually do and what they cannot do when we approach them with part of ourselves already decided. Padre Pio spent 50 years in that confessional. He earned every word. Honor that by passing it on. So here is what I want you to do. Not someday, not when you feel ready, because you will not feel ready. Readiness is not how this works. I want you to do this in the next 24 hours, and I am going to give you the exact steps that Padre Pio recommended for exactly this situation. First, open whatever you use to prepare for confession, your app, your notebook, a blank piece of paper, the notes function on your phone. And at the top of whatever you open, write one question, and then answer it honestly. What have I never confessed? Not, what do I usually confess? Not the comfortable list you have rehearsed. What is the thing or the category of things that you have been passing by in your examination of conscience for months or years? Name it. Use your own words. You do not have to make it sound right. You do not have to have the theological language correct. You do not have to fully understand why it was wrong. You simply have to name it, write it down, and do not delete what you wrote. This is critical. Padre Pio said that the act of writing it, of giving it a shape in words on paper, even if no one but God will ever read those words, is itself a spiritual act. It breaks the habit of abstraction. It moves the thing from the protected interior room where it has been living in the dark into the light of language where it can be seen. And once it is seen, it can be brought. Second, make a confession appointment, not soon, in the next week. Whatever you have to rearrange to make that happen, rearrange it. If your ordinary confessor is not someone you can bring this particular thing to, find a different one. A different parish, a retreat center, a monastery. This is not a betrayal of your regular confessor. It is the exercise of the freedom the Church gives you to bring your full soul to the sacrament. Padre Pio himself regularly heard confessions from people who had traveled enormous distances specifically because they could not bring something to their local priest. He never turned anyone away. He understood. Third, when you arrive at the confessional, begin with the thing you always leave out. Not at the end, not after the other items, not slipped in quietly when you are already deep into the rhythm of the confession. First, Padre Pio recommended this specifically because the habit of the concealed thing is to wait until the soul is already in a rhythm of disclosure, and then, in that relaxed state, attach itself to the end of the list at whatever size feels manageable. It will minimize itself. It will arrive hedged and contextualized and pre-apologized for. Begin with it instead. Say, "The thing I have never confessed is this," and then say it in whatever words you have. What you will discover on the other side of that confession, and I say this from experience, and from the accounts of every person in these testimonies who finally brought the thing they had been protecting, is not what you are afraid you will find. You are afraid, I think, that saying the thing out loud will make it more real, more permanent, more damaging to how you and God relate to each other. You are afraid that the confessor will react in a way that confirms the worst of what you think of yourself. You are afraid that the relief won't be real, that you will still feel the weight afterward, that the grace won't reach where it needs to go. None of those things happened to Marco Rinaldi. None of them happened to the man who waited 12 years and then heard Padre Pio ask, "What year did you first think about bringing this here?" None of them happened to the hundreds and thousands of people who stood in line at San Giovanni Rotondo, carrying the one thing they had decided they could not say, and then said it. What they found was exactly what Padre Pio promised. Not condemnation, not minimization, not the polite transaction of an uncomfortable exchange. They found the grace waiting on the other side of the door, patient, unchanged, offering the same thing it had been offering from the beginning: absolution, restoration. The room in the basement finally empty, the house finally warm all the way through. Do not wait. Whatever is in the box, whatever you burned the page about, whatever you moved past in the examination, whatever has been living in the basement of your soul while the rest of your spiritual life continued faithfully above it, bring it, not because God doesn't already know what it is. He does. Padre Pio knew before Marco walked across the courtyard, but he is waiting for you to stop protecting it, waiting for the moment when you arrive in front of him without the portion of yourself you've decided he isn't allowed to see. That moment does not have to be 8 years from now. It can be this week. It can be tomorrow. It can, if you will it, be today. And now, before I go, I want to ask you something directly. I want you to think about your last confession, not the sins you said, the sins you didn't say, the category you moved past, the item on the examination that made something in you flinch and you kept going. I'm not asking you to tell me what it is. I'm asking you to tell yourself, to say its name right now in the privacy of your own mind, honestly, and then to take that name with you into the next 24 hours and decide what you're going to do with it. Write everything in the comments if this video has named something for you, not what it named, just the word. One word to say, I heard this. I'm not moving past it again, because every person who writes that word in the comments is speaking for someone else who is watching this right now and hasn't yet found the courage to say anything at all. And sometimes knowing you're not alone is exactly the grace that opens the door.